Hello, and welcome to Historical Fiction with Kviatoslav. Obviously, the Viking Age provided a great deal of inspiration for historical fiction. It was basically the early Middle Ages was a time of bold warriors, great deeds, and heroic sagas. Heroes had a philosophy centered around the accumulation of glory and a belief that the only thing of enduring value was to be remembered in the songs and epic tales of their people. So obviously this inspired a lot of writers, a lot of great writers in the 20th century to use the Viking Age as background to produce a great deal of very good literature. So this list is basically my personal opinion on the five best Viking era stories that I've read in historical fiction from that time period. And obviously, this is a personal list, and I certainly haven't read anywhere near as much of the literature of the period as I would like. So obviously, this list could be subjective and change if I read more interesting fiction. But these are the things that I would like to discuss and basically recommend, as these were my favorites. We'll start off with a honorable mention, which is a book called Vinland the Good by Henry Treece, who was actually a children's author. He was writing in the 50s and 60s. I think this one is from 1967 there. And this is a short novel based upon the sagas of Eric the Red and the Greenland Saga, basically about the discoveries of Iceland and Greenland and trips to North America there. And it is a children's book, but it can be very much enjoyed by adults. As I've said before, I think that children in the past must have just been more receptive and more well read than they are these days, because it definitely doesn't talk down to children there. So that would be my honorable mention book. Starting the list, book number 5 is actually by one of my favorite authors, Poul Anderson, who is known as more of a sci-fi author there, but he wrote a number of historical fiction novels there. And this one's called Hrolfkraki's Saga, which is named after the main character there. And it is based upon another one based upon sagas there. The blurb on the back says Anderson's taken an ancient Danish saga and retold it in more or less contemporary language with modern sensibility to make a special book, which I think doesn't completely describe it well, because it's not necessarily modernized. It is made a little more accessible than a saga would have been, but he still really retains the feel of an old saga there. And if that's a bit challenging for the modern reader, that's might be to be expected, but it's a really excellent tale. Lots and lots of treachery and sagas. Don't be thrown off by the terrible cover, obviously chosen by the publisher there. But really excellent book, highly recommended there. So Hrolfkraki's Saga. Number 4 on my list is a book by my personal favorite author, Harold Lamb, which is called Swords of the Sea. And Harold Lamb was an author writing in the 20s and 30s up until the 60s there. And he was more of a historian, but he wrote a number of fantastic short stories, mostly published in the adventure magazines of the time. And he was really a big inspiration for Robert E. Howard and a number of other authors there. And he wrote fantastic historical fiction, extremely well researched, and he was an excellent plotter there. And this book was compiled a few years ago by Howard Edward Jones, who is a big fan, or Howard Andrew Jones, excuse me, a big fan of Harold Lamb there. And as you can say, there's a number of tales here about kind of Norsemen and the Norse days there. It's got some tales about Leif Erikson and some other famous Vikings there, but really, really well done, really exciting. And I'm a big fan of short stories because they don't require as much investment and can often be enjoyed in a single session. This one is only ranked number 4 just because not all of the tales in this book are actually Viking era tales there. It also has a number of pirate tales and tales of the British Empire and other areas there. But at least half of the stories are centered around Norsemen there. So it earns a place on my list. Uh, in number three, this one is another one that's maybe a bit of a cheat, would be seen as a bit of a cheat, which is also by Paul Anderson there. And this is called The Broken Sword. And it's actually not a historical fiction novel, but it's actually historical fantasy. But it is set in the British Isles and the Scandinavian lands, and many Norsemen are the main characters, and it has a great feel there. But it also has deals with trolls and elves, and it was actually written in 1954, which is the same year that The Lord of the Rings was published, which is a series that this book is often compared to. And a number of people would say it is superior to The Lord of the Rings. And I would probably say that as well, because it's just a fantastic read there. It's quite brief. It's only, let me check, just 207 pages. So it's so it's much less of a commitment than The Lord of the Rings. But it's also much darker. Tolkien's world was actually a lot brighter and a lot more positive, despite Sauron and so on. In this one, it's basically a war between trolls and elves. And the elves, the good guys, are actually just as kind of cynical and despicable as the trolls there. And it's about a family and a changeling who's replaced at birth. It really draws well from from Norse myths. So not really historical fiction technically, but there's enough historical fiction, particularly in the first half, to where it could make this list. My second choice is a book I've already spoken about in its own video there, so I won't spend too much time, but it's a book called The Long Ships by Frans D. Bengtsson there. And it's another one based on some sagas, but a really fantastic novel about Red Orm and his life and travels there, written in a very accessible but authentic sounding style there. So that would be my second one. Again, apologies for the poor cover there. Which brings us to number one, which came as a bit of a surprise to me when I was compiling the list, because it's actually another book by Henry Treece, and it's another book written for young people, young adults there, and it's called The Horned Helmet. And this is a very brief, very thin novel, and it's set around, excuse me, a young orphaned Icelandic boy named Bjorn, whose father commits suicide rather than face the local bully in a court case there. And it's really, I think no other book captures the kind of Norse attitude and lifestyle as much as this. As I said, it's a children's book, but it really can be enjoyed and appreciated by adults there. It could be enjoyed by intelligent children as well there. It's really fantastic, and it's amazing just how much it packs into 122 pages, even with some illustrations and so on there that are not fantastic, but do lend to the atmosphere a bit more there. And I won't talk about it too much because I want you to read it, because it is a fantastic book with many surprises, but it's got a lot of great messages. For example, the idea in the past of these kind of constructed families, of families that were through all the excesses of the age, that were built, not through blood, but through relations there. And really, it doesn't pull any punches. You're going to get a lot of the details of the age there, but not as, say, gruesome as it might be if the book were written for adults. But it's also another book which just was fantastic, which really couldn't have been written in this time. It was published, let me double check, 1963 there, and it really has the feeling of something written in the olden times. It really captures the feeling well. I was thinking of one example to illustrate that, and I'll just give away a single scene in the book. The boy Bjorn is adopted by a Viking crew of Jom's Vikings there, and he takes one of the Vikings kind of adopts him as a father type figure there. And in the course of their relationship, the boy Bjorn, asks about his mother, who was years and years earlier kidnapped by Vikings, and wants to know if the father figure was the one who actually kidnapped his mother. And they, through discussion, they actually find out that he was part of the crew that kidnapped the boy Bjorn's mother. Now, if this book were written in modern times, that would be incentive for revenge. Bjorn would spend the rest of the novel trying to kill the Viking who kidnapped his mother. But instead, Bjorn basically shows that he's a product of his times, and he accepts it. You know, he lived in an age when people were stolen, when people were sold into slavery. You know, when people were looking out for themselves in those ways, and doesn't really pass judgment on the Viking. Doesn't try to seek revenge. Still sees him as a father figure there, and that's a leap that only a boy born and bred in that type of environment, that type of era, would make, rather than trying to seek revenge in a kind of petty or modern way. So, The Horned Helmet, my top Viking recommendation book. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.